Today is Saturday, October 25th, 2025. My name is Aiden Abney, and I am interviewing Michael Kuo on behalf of the Houston Asian American Archive at Rice University. First, we'll talk about your early life, but please first state your first name, your full name, and where you were born.
So I'm Mike Kuo. I was born in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and glad to be here.
All right, nice. Could you share some memories of your upbringing, maybe uh, parts of your early childhood that you enjoyed,
Sure,
yeah.
sure. I grew up in what I thought was a fairly typical, in a lot of ways, upbringing in the 80s. So I had a group of neighborhood friends that I would hang out with. We played sports together, street hockey, baseball, wiffle ball, um, all sorts of sports and the way that children would interact in the 80s was just through hanging out and doing a lot of things, particularly outside. And I would do that with them, and it was fairly typical. Now, there were certain aspects of which I'm sure that we're going to get into at some point, the Asian American component of my upbringing that were probably unique to some of my other friends. But my upbringing was fairly normal in that respect. I know you're going to go into a little bit more about my family history, but I thought it was a very, very healthy childhood. A lot of good memories in it, but in many ways, it was pretty typical.
It's pretty typical. Okay, nice. Um, how would you describe the household you grew up in?
Yeah. My father was a microbiologist. He was a Taiwanese immigrant via Canada. My mom was also a Taiwanese immigrant. She was a nurse via from Taiwan to Canada to United States as well. So, in that sense, my parents, my older brother, who was born in Canada, comprised our whole household and really formed, the basis of my upbringing in the New York area.
Oh wow, that's very nice. What are some of the, I guess, special holidays or perhaps traditions that you recall growing up?
It's interesting. As a second generation Taiwanese American, we would do our best to integrate into a lot of the typical American holidays and traditions of the time. My mom especially was very adept in terms of picking up a lot of those traditions and holidays. She would work in a hospital as a NICU nurse with a lot of nurses who had traditional Irish American or Italian American backgrounds. And I got the sense that my mom got a lot of intel from these colleagues of hers around, hey, I'm hearing about St. Patrick's Day. How do I celebrate
Hmm.
that? Or I understand that my son is having a birthday. How do you guys, as Americans, celebrate birthdays? So she picked up on a lot of these cues from work, and I thought she brought them really well into our home. One of the great things that I'll remember is that she actually makes a really, really great corned beef for and cabbage for St. Patrick's Day. Thanks to a lot of her Irish American friends, she learned that. But that being said, there were certain cultural aspects of our Asian American background, or I should say, our Asian heritage, that certainly got translated into the everyday as well. At dinner, for example, our meals were typically Chinese in terms of nature. Um, there were certainly aspects of our upbringing that were clearly more Asian as far as a culture of filial piety in terms of the household. So, in that respect, we had an interesting hybrid of American as well as Asian American culture.
That's very interesting. I like the kind of the dynamic, or I guess the combination of the sort of Irish American traditions that your mom kind of picked up from and kind of maybe it really kind of combined in a sense with the Chinese
Yeah,
cultural traditions. Okay,
yeah,
that's very interesting. I've
it
never really
is.
heard that.
Yeah,
Oh, I've actually heard maybe like Mexican American
sure.
culture, for example, and Italian American
Yep,
culture being combined in some
yep.
sort of way, but just not Chinese American. I think that's very interesting though. Yeah.
Yeah, and in fairness, it was probably more of a mixture than a compound, if I can use those scientific phrases, because it wasn't as if that we would have corned beef and cabbage in Chinese
Mm.
broth or anything like that. It was just we did the American stuff, or we did the American holidays and traditions, but we also did a lot of the Chinese
Okay.
traditions as well.
I see. Okay,
Yeah.
that's very interesting. Um, did you face any social or parental expectations as a child?
Certainly, and I don't think this is unique to me, but I think as a second generation American, the child of Asian immigrants, a lot of the stories go along the lines of parents come from Taiwan, Philippines, Korea, China, Vietnam. They work really hard. They give up they give up the life that they are comfortable with in terms of language, in terms of food, in terms of culture, and they come to a very, very foreign land here in the West, whether
Mhm.
it's United States or Canada, but they do so to secure a better life for their children. That's the common story that you hear. And I certainly heard that story from my parents, and there was a degree of pressure that certainly was placed upon that. I think there's a couple of factors around there, one of which is that the rigor that a lot of these Asian parents experience back in their home countries just seemed harder scholastically than it did for my generation in our elementary and middle school settings. So I think because of that, there was a pressure of, well, hey, look, I mastered, and I'm half joking here, I mastered, you know, quadratic equations when I was in second grade. Why are you struggling with this as an eighth grader, for
Mm.
example? And so there was a heightened degree of, my school was harder, your school is easier, you should be mastering this. But because of the aforementioned context in terms of them leaving their home country to come for a better life, there was this sense of, we've given up so much so that you guys can be more successful than we've been. You have to do it. And the way that they always saw the key to that success was a great education, go to an Ivy League school. And
Mm.
obviously, to get into an Ivy League school, that came with a lot of academic and extracurricular activity to justify and to ultimately help secure that sort of admission.
Very interesting. Yeah. So yeah, I've seen a lot of that, especially with some of my Asian American friends who are second generation, right?
Mhm.
And I feel like for example, there's like a lot of people here at Rice too who are some of my
Absolutely.
friends,
Yep.
and they also are they have to deal with their parents. You know, have to call their parents every night and tell them about, hey, I did this well on my exam. Even if they go like maybe they get an 85 on their exam, which is I would say pretty good, I guess for a
At Rice
for
it is.
college. At Rice, it's
At
pretty
Rice it
good.
is.
They're still very disappointed. They
Yeah,
expect them to
sure.
do way better.
Yep.
And I feel like that does put a lot of stress. I feel like it puts a little unnecessary stress on those children. But I understand the context of where it comes from, you know, or
Yeah.
why it is that way.
And I think in part of the context of it also is this whole notion of, there's this whole notion of perfection that I think is very, very common in terms of uh, the first generations. I think previously, and it sounds like it's similar to even now, right? First generation being that it's the first; those are the folks that are emigrating from the Far East into the United States, and they have children, they have these expectations. Is that there's always this culture of, well, you got a 95. Tell me about the 5 points that you lost, and why did that happen? How are you going to prevent that in the future?
Mm-hmm.
It's a very much of a perfectionist
Yeah,
sort
it's
of
very
mentality in
perfectionist.
terms of driving towards that. Um, there is this whole notion of this risk adverse, failure adverse culture where there's this whole notion of that, hey, let's try to avoid the things that are preventable in terms of being incorrect. Um, did you study as hard as you could have to prevent those mistakes? So it's something that I think is common amongst those of us who are second generation children to
Mm.
have to go underneath that sort of scrutiny and that glare of, why aren't you perfect, or why can't you be more perfect?
That's very true. Do you feel like perhaps the society or I guess your parental expectations maybe influenced the subjects that you maybe had an affinity for in high
Yeah.
school?
Well, I think because of, in part of, there was this whole notion of growing up and wanting to be sure, the whole notion of perfection. Let's think about that. Where can you find objective perfection in terms of your school subjects. It's things like math and science generally, history to some degree perhaps if it's factual, but you can't debate whether 2 + 2 = 4, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's no gray area in terms of that. Whereas things that are social sciences, humanities, sometimes are more prone to subjectivity. And I think that's part of the reason why um, I think there's two dimensions where Asians, and I certainly had an affinity for math growing up um, for two reasons. One is that they're objective subjects, but number two, there are also things that our parents often studied and were also good at. My father and my mother were not going to teach me American history, but they could take the skills that they had around math and translate that to the second generation.
Mm, yeah.
So as a result, there does tend to be this notion of I've done it, I know it, I can transfer that to you. So let's stay with what works.
Mm.
And I think that's probably why we have seen traditionally a lot of focus in terms of the sciences, engineering, things of that nature amongst Asian second generation populations, because for their parents, and I think this was obviously done with good intentions, this is what they knew. This is what they also often mastered. And thus, they knew that as pathways that their kids could also succeed, and thus that got passed down.
That does make sense. Especially how they grew up
Yep.
in those Asian countries, whether it be
Yep.
Laotian or Vietnamese or Chinese.
Correct.
But yeah, that's very interesting. So you kind of did explain your parents' occupations. I guess the next question would be, what values did your parents instill in you that you still, I guess, keep or uh, kind of exemplify today? Or
Yeah. So my parents being healthcare focused, my brother actually followed their shoes and became a physician himself.
mm,
So my father was a microbiologist researcher, worked in a pharmaceutical company for many years. My mom was a NICU nurse. The common thread that you'll see amongst both my parents' profession and my brother's profession is that they focused in terms of healthcare. And as such, there was a high value in terms of, hey, we want to focus on things where we can heal, we can help, we can do good in the sciences, and that was certainly one area where they instilled that value of, hey, let's care for people, let's do good with the things that we're good at. There was also an interesting notion in terms of how they influenced career choices around that same line, because I think they've always seen, practically speaking, that as long as mankind is mortal, there will always be sickness. There will always be need for professions that promote health. So those are good professions to get into, particularly on the clinical side, given my parents and my brother's career. So they were certainly supportive of pursuing careers in that domain.
that's very nice. Okay, so I guess we can get into immigration a little touch
Sure,
of it.
sure.
But so you said your parents were immigrants, obviously.
Yep.
But how do you feel? How do you feel that aspect influenced your life in a
Mm.
sense? Influence a part of your life, let's say.
It's an interesting question because there's so much that you can tie with my parents being immigrants, which kind of ties into their overall identity, their culture,
Mm-hmm.
what their lives were as first generation Asian immigrants here living in the United States. So I think I would say that as a child of immigrants, I can certainly appreciate the challenge of moving to a new country, moving to a new culture, and trying to adapt within that same culture. I've seen the beauty of when a cultural heritage comes to a new cultural context and adapts, and even, dare I say it, evolves into a new Asian American culture. So my parents, as Taiwanese immigrants, came to Canada, as I mentioned earlier, and eventually to the United States. And they and I would say that there is something distinct between the Taiwanese culture and the Taiwanese American culture, because it is a hybrid in some ways of both the American culture as well as the Taiwanese culture. Um, in many ways, it takes aspects of both. And so I would say that it's given me a great deal of apathy, of sympathy for those who are in those situations. Um, it's allowed me to see the benefit in terms of how we have that melting pot here in the United States, where we've seen we've seen the American culture, the collective American culture, become stronger um, because of the contributions of different cultures all over the world. So I think it's given me a strong sense of affinity in terms of what immigration can do for a national identity.
For sure, for sure. So wait, I might want to read it, or I don't know if you mentioned what year did your parents move to Canada
They moved to
for
Canada
Toronto?
in 1963, I believe.
1963.
Yeah,
And then when did they come to United
and
States?
they came to the United States probably around 1970 or so.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, so that's not bad. So we'll get into a little bit of college education.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I'm probably gonna ask many questions about it because I'm very
Sure.
curious about how it was for you. But so could you state what college or what colleges that you attended and what years were they?
So I attended the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, graduated in '96, and I graduated from Columbia Business School in 2001.
2001, nice. So, what were the most interesting things that you learned during your time at, you can say, Wharton School or the Columbia Business School?
There's so much. So beyond the classroom, obviously learned a great deal in terms of strategic management, marketing, finance, operations management, which were my respective concentrations at both of those schools. But so much of what I learned was outside of those classes through the relationships that I had with classmates. The group work was invaluable. The interactions that I had with my classmates outside of the context of projects was also invaluable. The ability to interact with a diverse group of people who are just really, really, really smart and exchange ideas and bounce ideas and create great things together was in of itself a learning experience. So in some ways, everything that I learned in both of those schools solidified a key lesson around the key importance, the paramount importance of people. It all comes down to people. It all comes down to relationships at the end of the day. And that's not to say that technical skill isn't important. It's not to say that work ethic and um, problem solving ability isn't important. All of those things are. But at the end of the day, fundamentally, what gets accomplished in business is about how do you work together and collaborate with people. And that ultimately generally drives the success.
How do you collaborate with people? I like that a lot. And I feel like that is the value of going to these elite schools. It's not just that they're ranked in the top 20. I mean, that's what most people say, but it's more about the experiences that you have with other people. It's about the social aspect of it too. And like you said, I also do appreciate technical skill, appreciate everything that comes into STEM, let's say, but
Yep.
I also feel like that's been one of the most important things being here as well.
Yep.
And I can also attest from other people I've met who've gone to other great schools. So I do appreciate that. So what drew you to your major?
At both schools?
At both schools, right?
Yeah, so at Wharton, I really enjoyed the whole context of strategy, and so wanted to develop and hone some skills in that discipline. So strategic management made sense. As far as marketing, I wanted to have something that fed the creative beast within me. So marketing seemed like a strong pair to partner that strategic management. So that's where I did my dual concentration in. When I went to Columbia, one of the things that I was determined not to do is to do the same concentrations I had already done at Wharton. So
Yeah.
because of that, and because Columbia had a phenomenal finance program there, I wanted to take advantage of that at Columbia. So I did concentrate in part in finance. But the other component that I wanted to focus on was something a little bit probably more akin to something that I thought that I would eventually do, which ended up proving to be true, which is more operations management. So those two concentrations I thought supplemented well what I did at Wharton, hence my decisions around those concentrations.
So we kind of did touch on the most interesting things that you learned, but what specifically was one of your best moments in college, or maybe one of your
Sure.
not best moments? And it's fine to share any of them. It's fine.
Yeah, I have two kids in college. One of them is here at Rice, and the other is at Duke. And as I think about my two kids in college, I recognize that in addition to getting fantastic educations, in addition to um, being able to learn from world-class professors, ultimately what I believe is going to be the greatest thing that they take away is strong relationships with their fellow classmates and the ability to grow, not just intellectually, but in terms of character, in terms of emotional intelligence, and in terms of their own spiritual growth. So I think for me, what I would call the multidimensional growth that I experienced in college was sort of the highlight for me. So did I walk away more skilled from a business perspective? Sure, I did. But I also think that I grew into adult in some ways during my time at college. Spiritually, it was a big, important time for me as well in terms of developing a stronger Christian faith in my case as well. So I think what I remember at college is that it being a multidimensional time of growth for me in many different aspects, professionally, intellectually, academically, spiritually, emotionally, where I know this seems kind of a little trite, but you really do go from a child to a man during that time. So that was something that I took away as being a key part of going to college.
That's very nice. Yeah. So we'll go into your career, and the first question I'd ask is your how you felt when you
Yeah.
first landed your first job.
Yeah, it's funny. I actually have my first offer letter. I cut my teeth at Deloitte Consulting
Hmm.
when many years ago. And of course, the funny things, and I think I showed the offer letter to my kids, is just how little by today's standards that offer was, but very, very grateful for that. So anyone from Deloitte who's listening, thank you for the great offer. Really enjoyed my time there. Um, but yeah, the first offer and the first job you get out of college is you'll never forget it. It's one of the happiest moments that you have. Um, I just spent time talking about how the college is really a multidimensional time of growth. But in some ways, your job is similar in terms of having that sort of impact upon your life, because you're adulting fully
Mm-hmm.
at that point. You're earning a salary. You're dealing with grown up issues relative to responsibility and accountability. You're making real money. You have to understand what it means to be a good steward of the money that you're making, how to save, how to invest, all of those things. You're dealing with other adults, often older adults, in terms of how do you deal with professional conflict? How do you collaborate?
Mm-hmm.
How do you how do you manage situations that are challenging? All of those things are things that you get a crash course in during your first job. Uh, I chose consulting for my first job, as a lot of people do, and it was a tremendous experience, um, in terms of being able to teach me a lot of things in a relatively short amount of time. So you know, in all those respects, my first career was certainly foundational in terms of my future career prospects.
Okay, very nice. Do you have any advice on the first, I guess, interview when you get into your
Yeah,
first job after college? Really?
the first interview getting to your first job. You mean like so interviewing for your first job, or
I suppose that's
yeah? I mean, it's interesting because I think everybody's in the same boat. So senior year, I assume that Rice, like many other elite schools, has the career placement office, and I remember back at Penn, we had a pretty nice office, and you sit there as a senior, and you're like 20, 21 years old. You have no idea what you're doing. And you're sitting in a suit that you haven't worn that much, sitting across from a professional who's interviewing you. And what do you know? You're a college kid, right? So interviewers asking you questions, you're doing your best to not come off as completely ignorant. And you're just sitting there hoping and praying that whatever's coming in your mouth sounds somewhat intelligible. Um, and so, but having sat across the table from college interviewees, um, the interviewers know that they're not expecting perfection. They're not expecting anything technically deep. They're not expecting economic theory to necessarily flow from the mouths of college kids. So I think there's a degree that speak with confidence, but speak with humility. The key thing, I think, as undergraduates who are trying to look for that first job, um, I look for a couple of things as someone that interviews. I look for intellectual curiosity, and I look for learning agility, and I look for just personal humility. Those three things are actually really important to me because the intellectual horsepower is important just because, hey, look, I want the person to be able to walk into a job which is going to be somewhat uncertain in terms of what they have to do on a day-to-day basis and be able to figure it out. The learning agility is also important for those same reasons, to be able to think quickly, to ask the right questions. And the personal humility, I think, just makes someone really, really enjoyable to work with. It's what I call the airport test in terms of my interviewing rubric, which is if I was trapped in an airport with this individual, would I find that enjoyable or not? And that helps me determine whether I actually want to hire this person or not.
Very nice. Yeah, that is definitely very important. So maybe on my next interview I should note those things. And yeah, but so could you provide a brief timeline of just your professional experiences and just tell us how they maybe evolved over time?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I cut my teeth at Deloitte, like a lot of folks do. That time was actually bisected by my time at Columbia Business School. After a couple of years post MBA doing consulting, I decided to pivot to the corporate side or the client side, where I worked for Pfizer. Did that for almost 10 years. At Pfizer, had a number of different roles: information sciences, business technology, operational excellence. Was the chief of staff for the head of commercial operations. Did a stint as a director in corporate strategy. Then moved over to Cardinal Health, where I led commercial operations for one of their business units. Then left Cardinal Health to help kick off a nascent healthcare practice at Slalom. And then I went back to the client side at Elsevier, where I've been for almost 9 years now, taking a number of different roles there. Led operations for the assessment solutions business, led operational excellence, and then eventually am now leading business operations for the nursing and healthcare education department.
That's amazing. Wow, that's really good. Very accomplished. So we can get kind of like your daily routine. What does a typical day or week look like for you in terms of your job?
I mean, there's a lot of meetings. So there's especially in the business operations role, there's the things that are day to day. There are things that are being output from my teams. My teams being business intelligence, CRM optimization, sales operations, revenue operations, delivery operations. So there are things that my teams are churning out day to day. And for the most part, those things are very, very smooth. There's some seasonality, so there are some outputs that they're more in demand than others. So we certainly have our times of hyper busyness, and I would never say that there's times of not busyness, but it goes from like busy to hyper busy during certain seasons. But there's a lot of projects that are also going on in the background. It's all projects around how do we build the next big thing? How do we prepare for this that's going on within the market? How do we prepare for this that's going on internally? And so if you think about the day-to-day operations of what my team is doing, and you think about the projects, the initiatives, which are also happening in the background, there's just a lot of discussions, a lot of huddles, a lot of strategy sessions, a lot of pivoting, a lot of report ups. So this is how work is done. So it's about focusing on the near term, what needs to be done today, plus setting the groundwork of what needs to be done a month, 2 months, half a year from now.
Wow, very nice. What do you enjoy most about your job?
I enjoy working with people who are just very, very talented, very dedicated to the work at hand. There's something fantastic that I personally get as a manager in terms of seeing people grow. And I think professional growth is one of the greatest things that you can see as a manager and as a leader of people, where people maybe are not yet fully, have not fully developed the skills or the confidence to accomplish certain things, but you see that improve over time. You're providing coaching, you're providing direction, and you're ensuring that the people that are working under you have the tools, the resources they need to ultimately succeed. Um, Making the pieces connect together also is something that's really exhilarating. There's something that we hold as an enterprise value, which is about connecting the dots and making sure that we're connecting the dots together. And as someone who is a senior leader, being able to connect the dots together so that our initiatives are running as they should, so that we're solving problems the way that we should, there's a lot of joy in that as well.
A personal question I had is how would you approach someone that doesn't quite understand, let's say, the material as well, or is struggling, but they keep on struggling for a while and they don't necessarily get it quite yet? How do you approach that?
Well, there's a lot of ways that one can do that. I will take the time off personally to try to teach, train. I will also bring alongside others that know the content really, really well, that maybe went from a place where they were not so fluent or not so proficient in a given concept or topic, then developed mastery to ask, hey, you didn't understand this concept, this topic really, really well. And over time, you developed a strong sense of proficiency and mastery. How did you do that? And I'd love for you to talk to Bob, for example, to be able to unlock that same aha, because Bob is struggling with this. And you went from novice, amateur to proficient in this. There's something that you did or something that you perhaps were exposed to that helped you get that level of mastery. Let's see if you can share that best practice.
Yeah, does sound like I guess a good way of trying to gauge someone's learning, and then also kind of, now I guess it wouldn't be comparing, but it would be more, hey, here's an example of someone who also doesn't get it, and you know, or someone who didn't get it at first and then finally has the solution, and that's very nice. How did your earlier experiences in pharmacy services shape how you now lead teams at a global information company?
Yeah, I mean, I think at any time that you go through different leadership managerial experiences, you try to take away, what did I do well as a manager at this given company? What could I do better as a manager at this different company? And you bring that to bear in terms of your next role. And certainly at Cardinal Health, I was a relatively young manager at the time, relatively new manager at the time. Even though it was a lot of folks that I had that was reporting into my department. There were things that I did really, really well. There are things that I probably could have done better. And I think you take that into your next role in terms of, hey, maybe I should have handled things better in terms of this. Maybe I should have handled conflict, this conflict that I had with this other senior leader better. Or maybe instead of just allowing this to fester and hoping that this will go away, I would have just had a conversation and just brought everything into the light and say, hey, let's clear the air around this. Let's hash this out. Our departments seem to be misaligned in conflict around this. How can we get this resolved sooner than later? So it's things like that. There's all of these different managerial and leadership lessons that you learn every day, honestly. And the key is that, well, how do you build upon that to become a better leader the next day?
That's nice. So at Elsevier, you've overseen digital transformation and operational excellence. So I'm curious, what does digital transformation mean in day-to-day terms or in practical terms in your view?
So a lot of it, especially in our domain, has to do with how do we increasingly go from a more print business to an electronic business. And you see that everywhere. And there's so many different contexts in which this is true. So for traditional publishers, you see that in terms of the movement from print books as being an area of focus for commerce to an electronic book being an opportunity for commerce. Now, obviously, beyond just so you probably utilize ebooks to some degree right here at Rice.
Yeah.
Right. And so how would you differentiate a print book from an ebook in your own experience?
I mean,
which format do you prefer?
Which format I prefer? Okay, for my personal view, I actually prefer print books.
Really? Why?
Yeah. It's what I've grown up with.
Okay.
That's kind of what I was when I was first given something to read, for example, at school or by my parents. It would be printed books or.
I see.
Yeah.
And the ebook format for you find it limiting, I guess, relative to what you have for a print book?
I mean, I guess I suppose it would be in my point of view. For me, it's a little limiting. But here at Rice, that's what they have for
Right.
the different assignments that you have to read based on a book that they give you, a PDF file or whatever. And that is there's a lot of other ways you can get some of those books that they give you through ebooks and make them, like, for me, I do like print books better. And so sometimes I'll try to print it off of the computer room because I for some reason my preference is always like I explained, it's a more of a thing I was taught in school and by my parents. But I don't necessarily mind ebooks.
Yeah.
I just don't prefer them as much as I do print books.
So the exciting thing about digital transformation, and you'll see this between the print, using this example of the print textbook versus the print or the ebook, is that what the ebook media does, or the best ebook media or the best electronic solutions, I should say, do, and this is obviously coming from Elsevier, this is something that we promote. The electronic media is not just a digitized version of the print book. It's so much more. So for example, if I could tell you that you can interact utilizing AI tools with your ebook, would that change your calculation? Or what if I said that, you know what, we could give you adaptive quizzing as part of your ebook so that we could, after every chapter that you read, Aiden, we could just test your mastery and make sure that you are increasingly. Would that change your mind?
That would change my mind.
So
that's
what I'm getting at. So the things that you can do with electronic solutions as opposed to print books is just so much far. It's exponentially greater, and that's the exciting thing about digital transformation, is that it's not just a PDF version of the print book. The things that you can do relative to video, to adaptive quizzing, to AI tools, with electronic media is just so much more. So that's the exciting thing, is that how do we move folks from a one-way learning experience in this example, and this digital transformation example, to something that's more immersive, that's actually ultimately helpful for student outcomes. And that's the thing that's really exciting.
So yeah, I have I just realized more traditional view on how I view that. But I definitely see that ebooks are not just quote unquote ebooks. It's not just limited to that. So now understanding that, it's kind of given me a little bit different perspective. But I definitely think that more, especially in my future as I get more to senior year, I believe AI is going to be more of a part of my routine, more of how I study. But it's not going to be like copying assignments, obviously. It's going to be quizzing myself using AI. I know there's Turbo AI. A lot of undergraduates here at Rice use to quiz themselves. They record the professor, they're lecturing, gives them study notes.
That's right.
So there's that. So I also saw on your LinkedIn that you were the director of Pfizer, or you told me too, and the chief of staff. Could you tell us about what insights you gained from those positions, as well as what insights you gained from collaborating with health systems like Mayo Clinic and Cleveland Clinic?
A lot of different things in those things, but you mentioned the chief of staff role, and let me just focus on that one specifically. So a chief of staff role is a tremendously, at least in my opinion, a tremendously fun role. Have you ever watched the movie The West Wing, or the television show The West Wing?
I'm not, no.
Okay, so it's a political um, drama that Martin Sheen plays President Bartlett, and it shows everybody in his staff, and it's a dramatized version of the White House. So Leo McGarry is actually the chief of staff there, and you get to see it's sort of how the sausage gets made a lot. And as a chief of staff, what you're asked to do is essentially be the right hand person for the senior leader. And so you come to the realization that there's a lot of things that you're doing organizationally, relationally, just to kind of smooth things out. There are things that you're trying to get off the plate of the senior leader so that the senior leader can fully focus in terms of the most important things, the strategic things that are going to ultimately move the business. You're enabling by helping organize thoughts, organize deliverables, crafting decks, but you're also playing a little bit of a consigliere role also in terms of being able to have side conversations with some of the people that work for him. Because sometimes there may be a conversation where a given senior leader may not want to have this conversation directly with this other senior leader, and you have to kind of be the go-between in those situations. So a chief of staff does that.
Okay.
It's a great role. So yeah, I learned a lot because going back to my original point in terms of so much of success in business is about relationships and relational IQ. You really need to have very, very strong relational IQ in that kind of role.
That's very true. So I'm going to kind of touch on AI again.
Sure.
Talk about more about its role in transforming researchers' work. So what do you think its role will be in research, and what kind of mechanisms will be in place to fact check the papers that might be possibly generated by AI or the sort?
Yeah, so there's always going to be this degree of quality assurance, quality control that's going to be required for artificial intelligence outputs. Ultimately, what AI is going to do is going to supercharge the productivity in terms of any process, whether it's research, whether it's other domains. AI ultimately becomes the great equalizer, the great accelerator in terms of productivity across the board. But I don't believe it's ever going to replace people fundamentally, in the sense that the human role is still going to be there. I know there's been a lot of conversation around AI, and I think one of the pundits say that it's sort of a proactive response to a lot of the concerns around Skynet, Whopper, whatever you've seen in terms of the movies around the fear about AI is that, and I think the quote was something along the lines of, AI is not going to replace humans, but humans who use AI will replace the humans that don't. Mm-hmm. And I think there's some truth to that in the reality that there is no greater powerful combination than humans plus AI, but you need to have both. Now, our ability in terms of how we use AI to gain those productivity gains is going to continue to evolve and advance over time as humans unlock AI to become more effectual and beneficial for our day-to-day uses. But I think I think it's good for all of us. The question around how is it going to transform researchers' work? I think it's going to make it much more productive and much more prolific. And if researchers are ultimately going to be able to churn out more insights, to be able to share their data, their insights more effectively than before, I'm all for that. And I think that's the role that AI can play.
It's very nice. I also believe that AI has this sort of stigma around it, and it's because it's, relatively new, and I've just seen a lot of pushback from it, but I ultimately believe that it is going to benefit us in the long run. And it might, some jobs might not thrive because of it, I think specifically in the humanities, possibly, but I think many jobs will be created out of it, although some have had some counterpoints to that. Mm-hmm. But I would argue that in the long run, it's going to benefit us.
Yes.
So in terms of your career, again, I think the last question till we go on to more, you know, Asian
Sure.
American career oriented questions. What do you consider to be the greatest challenges and highlights of your career?
I would answer that in the same vein that I answered some of the previous questions, that it's people. And I would actually answer that. I would actually say that the greatest challenges in my career have often been people,
Mm-hmm.
and the greater highlights of my career have often been people. If you, again, if I stress that in so much as that business is largely relationship oriented, um, the most challenging parts of my career have been dealing with difficult people. I mean, in fairness, these people might say that I was being difficult, but it's fundamentally when you're dealing with situations where you fundamentally disagree, or you just cannot align with an individual, or you find that somebody is being obstinate, arrogant, difficult to work with, unable to flex, not willing to meet partially, um, difficult to collaborate with. Those are fundamentally hard, and especially
Mm-hmm.
when your success is dependent on working with this individual, that's very very challenging. But I think in the same way, the highlights of my career have been working with great people and seeing the successes forged by those sort of partnerships and those sort of collaborations. There's no greater highlight than to win together. I think about, just even personally, whenever you watch TV and watch sports, as I love to do, there's something about a team celebrating at the end of winning a World Series or winning at a Super Bowl. And very rarely do you see someone off in the corner celebrating by himself, because you realize that the greatest joy is celebrating with other people that help you get to the top of the mountain, which is very much what it's like in business as well.
That is, yeah, that is true. Um, Especially in a team setting, I take something like basketball that I've been a part of, and uh, I mean, I don't like the fact that if I'm going to celebrate, it's it's not with my. I mean, even if it wasn't with, I could see how maybe um, a team is obviously, I think, beneficial,
Mm-hmm.
especially when you're celebrating goals that you've accomplished.
Yep.
But I also think like family is also an amazing part of that, and
Yep.
that could be also seen as a team. I mean, your family is a team that helped you, supported you throughout the way.
Absolutely.
But there's that. So I guess now we're going to transition to the title Asian American and career oriented questions. The first question is, what is your perspective on Asian American representation in your field?
I think it's gotten a lot better over the past 20 years. Um, I remember coming in as a new analyst at Deloitte, finding Asian American role models was challenging. I remember even when I joined Pfizer after my stint at Deloitte, that finding Asian American role models was still challenging. But thankfully, we've come a long way, I think, in terms of Asian American representation at the highest levels. So Jane Hyun is a friend of mine. She wrote Breaking the Bamboo Ceiling. She's considered an expert in the field around this whole topic. And I think Jane would probably also acknowledge that there's been a lot of change. But that's not to say that there isn't more progress to go. So a lot of the folks in my generation have grown from those people wanting those role models, and are fortunate to say that in many ways, we are those role models now. Um, but it took some time for us to get there. Dave Liu, who I went to school with, is very, very active in this field as well, as part of Hyphen Capital. So there's a lot of folks all around, you know, corporate America, global capital, I guess I would say, that have done very, very well, and have are being generous in terms of giving of their advice, giving of their experiences to others, to ensure that the representation is where it needs to be. So all to say is that I think we've come a long way, but obviously we continue to ensure that to look to ensure that that representation continues to remain.
So yeah, it was challenging to have a Asian American role model. Uh, did you not have one before, or was it more of like with your
It was
career?
harder. It was
It was
harder. I mean,
harder.
yeah. I mean, there weren't many,
Yeah.
um, but there were a few, and I think the key is that the whole attitude towards somebody's Asian Americanness. Here, this is what I would say is that I have found that there is sometimes, and I want to be careful about painting this in a broad brush. There is sometimes concern about being pigeonholed as an Asian American business leader, senior leader, because people don't want to be pigeonholed as such. They said, like, part of the reason why I want to accomplish what I did was because I don't want to be seen as the Asian American leader. I want to be seen as a business leader that stands on my own merits, which I can respect that perspective. But I do also recognize that there is something powerful about having somebody look up to you demographically and say, well, I've never seen anybody of insert demographic label here. I've never seen like someone of this demographic succeed in this field, but now I've seen one. So do you know what? Now I think that I can do the same thing, and that there's power in that. And so for someone to be able to have that role model, to see that that's something that's achievable, and if possible, to be able to be mentored by that individual, I think is really powerful and really valuable. So again, I'll reference Jane's book, which I think speaks to a lot of things that, especially very, very helpful for second generation Asians, around how there are certain aspects of cultural upbringing that are very, very common, even saluted within the Asian culture, that actually can be harmful in a traditional American business culture. So, for example, one of the example I believe Jane gives in her book is the American axiom is that the squeaky wheel gets the oil. The Asian axiom is the quacking duck gets shot. So based upon those two, that may inform your way of how often do you raise your hand? How often do you speak up during meetings? So in the squeaky wheel gets the oil, what's being implied there? That being outspoken leads to success. If you believe in the quacking duck gets shot, and that's your cultural paradigm, you're not raising your hand. You're not trying to stand out. So you see how there's a conflict in terms of the perceptions around. So if you're raised in a certain cultural context that tells you that the quacking duck gets shot, are you the person that's going to raise your hand when the boss asks a question? You're probably not, right? So it's examples like that which I think are very astute in terms of recognizing that there are certain cultural norms that may be even subconsciously embedded within us that may actually prevent prospering in a business career, for example.
Very interesting. I guess that does, I think, make a lot of sense, not just with Asian Americans, and that's a broad term, Asian Americans, because I think I'm talking more about specifically East Asian Americans, but that is also, I think, pretty true for like Indian Americans, for example, and for Filipino Americans. But that's also, I was going to say, true for a lot of different ethnicities, and it's not just like the example you gave. It could be different types of limitations to social interactions in the business field or being as outspoken. True for, I don't know, European Americans, for South Americans. It kind of depends. But I have seen it before firsthand. So how well do you believe Asians or Asian Americans are represented among Elsevier's published authors, editors, or reviewers?
I think it's something that we continue to look at. I think it's I would say that we're always looking for good representation across demographically, not just for Asians, but for all demographics across the board. One of the things that we always are conscious of is that do we have any blind spots relative to representation? We want to be an organization, especially one that has so much pride in our content, that doesn't have blind spots. And so how do you avoid blind spots? You make sure that there's healthy representation across the author, editor, and reviewer pool. And I know that our organization works hard to ensure that is always being looked at.
That's good. So, as an executive of Elsevier, what's your view of the racial bias that possibly still exists in publishing? And I'm going to read you a study, or I guess I'll kind of summarize this recent study that was in Elsevier.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a published journal that identified persistent racial inequality in the psychological publication process.
Yep.
So, and it said even research on race was found predominantly led by white authors. So, how do you feel just about what I
Yeah.
gave you there? How do
Yeah.
you feel?
No, I think I stand by the study. It's something that we have looked at. It's something that we are continuing to look at. I think the broader publishing world needs to continue to look at representation. It goes back to the blind spots that I talked about. Is that if we as publishers across the board want to acknowledge fairness and the elimination of these blind spots that I talked about in terms of the content that is being propagated and published, we need to recognize that representation is one important tool that we can use to ensure that we can make sure that there isn't those blind spots, that we can eliminate those elements of racial bias that exists in terms of content. Of course, it's not just racial bias. There's other sorts of bias that exists out there. So representation is one of the key tools that we can certainly use to ensure that we mitigate that and improve upon that.
Okay. Pretty much kind of did answer the next question, but
Mm-hmm.
what barriers still exist for Asian professionals aspiring to these professional business positions, like executive or editorial, in major publishing firms?
Yeah. I think we're still trying to figure those out because I think we certainly, given my previous answer in terms of if we are dedicated to ensuring that there's the right representation across the board for these senior leader positions, and my hope is that that the talent pool continues to look at those areas, and this is where my concern, Aiden, is that there's a certain degree of self-selection outside of certain groups, in fear that I don't know if I can be successful in this field because I'm a certain demographic. I'll give you an example. Actually, I'll personalize it to myself. Fun fact, when I was in college, my dream was to do sports management. I want to be the next GM of the Yankees, the Knicks, what have you. And I actually did score an internship with the New Jersey, actually at that time it was the New Jersey Nets, which my father, well-intentioned, actually forbid me to take. And his reason was there are no Asians in that field. And so I didn't fight it. I mean, I was disappointed, but I didn't fight it. And my rationale was, well, he's probably right. Well, why would I stack the deck against myself by going into a field where there's no others that have succeeded in this? But of course, obviously then I didn't take the road less traveled, which may be regret, right? And I fear that you have a similar phenomena here in terms of self-selecting out of certain fields because you don't see. So think about the fields that exist in business right now that may be underrepresented, and you maybe have a certain demographic and you don't see role models there. So there's two things that you can do. You can say, well, I'm going to go to another one. I'm going to work in tech because I'm going to use that example. I'm going to work in tech because I see a lot of Asian Americans there. Or I'm going to get a health professions type role because there's lots of Asians there.
Mm-hmm.
What a tragedy would be if your natural skill set was actually going to be in that field that happens to have no Asians today, because you took a look at that and said, well, I don't know if I'm going to make it, right?
Yeah.
So all to say is that do barriers still exist? Do structural barriers still exist? Unsure, and I certainly hope not. And as I mentioned, I think those of us who are working in these companies, it's on us to make sure that those are addressed. But one thing that we can't solve, even from the inside, is self-selection out of those roles. So if there are people that want to dive into, if there are people that want to find careers as editors, as senior leaders in the publishing domain, in editorial positions, and you're someone that feels that you're demographic is underrepresented, I would appeal to you to keep at it, keep going,
Mhm.
because we need the pioneers. We need the pioneers in those roles.
No, that's very true. And uh, I guess I could give a personal experience too I've had with that because, I want to go into medicine.
Mm-hmm.
I am of Mexican American ethnicity and
Yep.
identity that I subscribe to from both of my parents.
Yep.
But my mom has Mongolian ancestry due to her dad.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and being in San Antonio, I thought I would see a lot more. I've seen Mexican Americans in all different fields, and the exception was medicine.
Yeah.
And I'd go to the doctor's office. I saw mostly, white American. You would see, Black American. You would see different Iranian American too. I never once came across Mexican American or really a Mexican doctor, at least where I was.
Interesting.
And I believe at one point I did come across a Mexican doctor, but it didn't feel the same because it wasn't a Mexican American. And my mom was always like, and I know uh, that, and that did, speak to me in a certain way because I was kind of convinced that there's not a lot of Mexican Americans in the field that I want to do, then why do it? I mean, I was kind of discouraged.
Yeah.
I would look even online. I would look at different. I would just look at doctors. I never once saw a Mexican American. I thought I saw one. I was like, oh, cool, but it was South American doctor from Peru, and I think that is very important,
Yeah.
especially
Absolutely.
in every field. I think in most fields it's important, and it shouldn't discourage you
Yeah.
from going into that and
Absolutely.
and taking advantage of the skills that you've acquired, the skills that best fit you.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's right for some people to discourage you, or I guess self-subjection to
Yeah.
that sort of stuff is also I feel um unnecessary, and just to pursue it,
Yeah. Go for it.
let's
Exactly.
go for it.
We need pioneers.
Yeah.
And by the way, Aiden, I don't know if did you find your Mexican American doctor role model yet?
There have been,
Good.
but
Well, the
yeah.
funny thing is that my wife and I happen to be good friends with a Rice alum who is a Mexican doctor, so Mexican American doctor. So
That's cool.
happy to share her name after the podcast if you're interested.
Yeah. That's very. Actually, I'd like to know. Yeah, that's
Sure.
really cool. But just last thing though, like yeah, it just doesn't speak the same to me. And also, I feel like you see that a lot in Mexico.
Yeah.
You don't see that a lot here in Texas a lot.
Mm.
But that is just my opinion. That's what I've seen. But I'm sure that I've seen some for sure. I've seen more and more now
Yep.
that I've researched, but it just didn't feel like where I was. And even my mom was like, I never came across a lot of educated Mexican Americans who went on to do med school, who went on to.
Mhm.
But she did go to. My mom did go to high school with the Joaquin. What's the name? Joaquin Castro.
Okay. Yep.
So she went
Yep.
to school with both of them, who went eventually to
cool.
Harvard Law School.
Yep.
But
Yep.
yeah, that's very cool. So okay, we talked about that. Have you experienced any racism or discrimination as an Asian American in your field?
If I have, it hasn't been overt, and I think thankfully, I grew up in a time. I grew up professionally in a time where at least overt exhibitions of racism were considered, tremendously prohibited and uncool. So, at least as far as I'm concerned, if I have experienced it, it hasn't been overt.
You don't remember a specific time, or it was just?
I mean, it's always it's so hard to say, right? And because there's so much there's so much that happens in the context of the business in terms of why decisions are made, who gets a promotion, who's passed up for promotion. It's very, very challenging to be able to allege racism specifically in terms of those situations. Have I ever felt othered? I think in the times that I have, I don't think it was intended. Um, so, I've been pretty fortunate, but I know that I certainly grieve at times where I know other Asian colleagues have experienced that. Um, and I find it hard to believe that it never exists. So, yeah.
Uh, what was your reaction to the string of violence against Asian Americans during COVID? And were there times when you possibly felt unsafe because of your ethnicity? If you're walking down the street, for example, let's say during those string of anti-Asian violence that was occurring during COVID.
Yeah, no, I certainly grieved the violence against Asian Americans during that time, and it's unfortunate, right? Because the the there was so much misinformation around that was going on around COVID that I think fanned the flames and poured gasoline into some of the emotions around that. Um, yeah, so I certainly grieved it. Did I ever feel unsafe specifically because of my ethnicity? I'm happy to say no, but again, I know that others that did, and that's that's not acceptable. Um, it's the whole notion in terms of there. One of the things that I am sensitive about that I do realize is that there were a lot of jokes around. There were a lot of jokes that happened during COVID, some of which kind of touched on the whole Asian origins of COVID, um, that I thought were unnecessary, that I think were unnecessarily um, provocative. That it's interesting because even if these even if this humor was meant to be harmless, I recognize that the potential of how that could inflame people who didn't have context, didn't know any better. So I think what happens is that unfortunately you add racism to ignorance, it could be a very, very volatile mix. And I think those situations can lead to the kind of racism and even violence that you see. Um, so again, certainly grieve the violence, certainly condemn the violence, but I was fortunate to have largely, at least overtly, experienced that myself.
Oh, that's nice. What is your opinion? This is the last question, by the way, before
Mm.
we move on. But what is your opinion on how the Asian American community has interacted or has intersected with other communities, the Black American, Hispanic American, White American? Um, Maybe your viewpoint on the
Yeah,
history of all of that.
yeah. I think we can do better. And what I mean by that is relative to all of those demographics, the Asian American community can do better. And I think part of it is that, and this is where maybe I'm unique in my position, is that I've heard a lot of talk at times in terms of co-belligerence, right? And I get uncomfortable in terms of, hey, partner with this demographic or this political group around this topic against these people, and it's like this whole like playing off each other sort of mentality that I find that I'm not completely comfortable with. So one of the topics that you'll find a lot of different, very strong opinions on is relative to things like affirmative action and some of the even the lawsuit that's going, I think that's ongoing relative to some higher education schools in terms of disproportionate admissions and how that impacts different demographic groups. And in a nutshell, one of the things that's being talked about is that, well, hey, these some of these admissions practices discriminate against Asians and whites. And what you'll get from a lot of those in the Asian American community is that, hey, don't get suckered into that, because the blacks and Hispanics are our friends and our allies. This is just a way to get racist whites to vote against your best interests, right? And I don't know if that's necessarily wrong, but what I am comfortable is that even in that statement, it's trying to build up these factions in terms of who's against who, right? So without casting an opinion specifically in terms of that specific case, what you're doing is that, okay, so basically you're saying that the right thing to do is to ally with blacks and Hispanics against the whites. I'm not sure that's a good thing either, right? So I'm not comfortable in this whole Asian and whites against blacks and Hispanics. I'm not comfortable in terms of Asians, blacks, and Hispanics against whites either. So it's like this, when did we become factionalized like that in terms of how we draw the lines? So, but and I know that comes off as a really overly simplistic way to deal with very, very complex problems. And then yes, I'm not addressing the minutia of why people have strong feelings around admission practices, which is something that we're not going to cover at this podcast. but I think it's clear that there's been this degree of factionalism that exists within, the Asian American community. I mean, and part of me is also like, what is that? Because Asian Americans are not monolithic, right? Asian Americans actually vote vote in a very, very diversified way, socioeconomically diverse, and so it's just this whole notion of a block I think is incorrect as well. But maybe my point is this: is that in so much as that you believe that Asian American people need to interact better with those who are black and Hispanic and white, I think the answer is yes. But frankly, I think every group needs to do a better job. And I'll evolve that into a more general observation around discourse and race relations and just interpersonal relationships over the past 5 years, which I think we can all get better at.
I agree with that. I think many communities, including white communities and Hispanic communities, black communities, can, I think, have their own internal problems, and I feel like it's we all have to kind of work it out.
Yep.
Well, whether you agree or not, together or separately, we have to work them out somehow. And then from there, I think we can come to some coalition. But that's kind of more of an internal problem rather than like, oh, this group is inflicting more pain on that group. And,
exactly.
It's just that it keeps that cycle going.
Yep.
So finally, we'll get into some of our last questions, more about your identity and personal life.
Yeah.
So can you tell us about your family and how did you meet your spouse?
Yeah, so I'm very fortunate to be married to Sarah, who's my wife. Sarah is a former Juilliard and Columbia grad. We actually met at Columbia. She was doing her master's in education. I was doing my MBA there. We were also involved in the same Christian fellowship. We were also involved in the same church in New York City, which is where we met. I mentioned that I have 2 kids in college, so I have a son who's here at Rice, a daughter who's at Duke, and another daughter who's currently at high school. And we have a good thing. Very, very grateful for what I have there.
Yeah. If you don't mind me asking, what is your son majoring at Rice?
Yeah, he's a comp sci guy.
Oh, comp sci, nice. Okay,
yes,
cool.
You probably have friends in that major, and
yes,
they're going through a very interesting time right now with AI and everything else.
Yeah, no, I have a lot of friends in computer science right now, and they some of them really enjoy it. They're just like, oh yeah, I like what I'm doing. Some of them are trying to survive.
Yes.
So they're just trying to survive and hold on to those grades right now.
Yeah.
So that's very nice. That's very nice. How close are you with your parents currently, or your family currently? But you kind of talked about your family, but your parents, yeah.
I think we're all pretty close. My parents are very elderly at this point, but still hanging on there. But obviously, time has done its thing with them, both physically as well as mentally. But we're close. They're up in New Jersey, as well as my brother and my brother's family. They're up in New Jersey as well, and we're close. We talk regularly. We check in on each other. Very, very blessed to have a strong family, and we keep in touch around how things are going. We talk about the kids. So very much part of that sandwich generation, which I use that phrase as elderly parents, still the kids that are around. So you're trying to deal with making sure that both of those guys are doing okay.
Oh, that's very nice. So, what are your hobbies and interests outside of your career?
Yeah, so I'm very involved in my church. So I serve as an elder at Redeemer Presbyterian Church in Sugar Land. So I'm very, very active there. I'm a big sports guy. I play tennis, but I also watch a lot of sports as well. Big football, baseball, basketball guy. So my I mentioned I'm from the New York area originally, so my fandom is mostly Knicks, Rangers, Yankees, Giants, and then. But I'll secondarily root for the Houston teams, which is great. Probably spent a little bit more too much time on fantasy football than I really should. But following my teams is great as well. But and then my wife and I loves to stream, so we'll watch things on occasion together and spend quality time there. So between those things, our church involvement, and then the regular rhythms of parenthood, those keep me pretty busy.
That's true, yeah. What are your top three NBA teams?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, two of them are actually contenders, so definitely Knicks, and I think Brunson. I like the change to Mike Brown. I think he's the right coach for the right time for the Knicks. Um, the Rockets, I'll follow as well, and I think the Rockets are going to be really, really good this year. Obviously, Durant was a great trade. Um, as far as my third team, I'll probably go back and I'll say Brooklyn. They're hurting. I think in the season right now where they're really tanking. They got to rebuild, but those are probably my top three.
That's nice. Yeah. I'd say my top three are like okay. So I grew up in San Antonio,
Yep.
so
I
I'd
think
say
maybe a
like
Spurs fan.
Spurs. Yeah, Spurs. Probably second, Houston Rockets, and third would be Dallas Mavericks. So they're all in Texas.
I respect it. See, so it's interesting. You have the philosophy. So obviously, I'll root for the Nets. I'll root for the Mets. I'll root for the Jets, even though I theoretically root for the other team. There are some that believe that you can't root for your rival teams, right? Because I know that there are some that I know that there are some Rockets fans around here that hate the Spurs,
Yeah.
that hate the Mavericks. You're not one of them though, so apparently you're comfortable with the whole. I'll root for Texas,
Yeah.
even though they're theoretically rivals with each other.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's just how I like both teams. My dad was a great fan of both of those teams,
Yep.
and he always like, okay, they have rivalry. Like, so what? I like them. They're in
That's
Texas.
right.
Who cares?
Right. Well, you're gonna have a lot to root for over the next 10 years because that team is loaded.
Yeah,
Wemby's
that
gonna
is very
be
loaded.
probably the best player in a couple
Yeah.
of years, and no, Spurs are
Crazy.
gonna be good for a while.
It's crazy skilled for his height. It's crazy. Yeah.
Yes.
So I guess I'll skip that question. But what do you feel most proud of in general? Just your life right now, your career. What do you feel most proud of?
I think the answer that a lot of parents will give this is their children, and I think I am proud of that. Is that my wife Sarah and I have been able to raise three kids that we believe represent good. Um, they do good. They are good. They really love people. They really love God. They have great character, and they're I think they're in the right direction. I think there's a large desire to see that the next generation is, if you're a parent, that your next generation is going to do good in this world.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel that between Daniel, Sophia, and Carissa, they're on that track. So my pride is really of them, I guess, in terms of who they are right now and who I believe that they will become.
That's nice. You said you're a Presbyterian, right?
Yes, that's correct.
All right, that's very nice. Were you Christian for most of your life, or
No, it's
Presbyterian?
interesting. I was nominally Catholic actually.
Oh, okay.
Growing up, meaning that I was an Easter and Christmas kind of guy. Our family was very, very not pretty much non-religious, but it was actually through my best friend in high school was evangelical, and even though I told him politely no numerous times, he kept trying to like, hey, come to church with me, read the Bible with me, and I'm like, not interested. Let's just talk about girls and Transformers or sports or whatever. And he gave me a copy of Our Daily Bread, gave me a Bible, and said, hey, why don't you're hey, Catholics read Bibles, right? I think so. So eventually he got me reading the Bible a little bit more, and then he started telling me more and more about Jesus, and that was actually really key in terms of me taking my faith more seriously over time.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Nice. Do you have any advice for Asian American young adults or the youth, and also specifically those aspiring to work in your field of
Yeah,
expertise?
yeah. I would just continue to I would just encourage them to know their worth and recognize the first of all recognize these cultural these inborn raised with cultural dynamics that they have grown up with, and um don't have a distaste for them, and don't reject them, because there's so many things that are beautiful about Asian culture. I mentioned the whole quacking duck thing earlier, and I want to be absolutely clear that the point is not for us to reject those things or disown those things or to in any way despise those things. It's really for us to understand that there are elements of the Asian culture that we've been raised with that have an impact in terms of how we portray ourselves in the business world. And there's a degree that there's a lot of things about our culture that and the way that we've been raised, and some of this is personality, um, which may be misperceived as weakness or not necessarily good for business. And just be mindful of that. And the reason why I say know your worth is because I think that's something that is common, still is common with a lot of Asian Americans. This whole concept, I don't know if you've heard of this, Aiden, this whole concept of imposter syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
And I do believe that this is something that still is very, very common amongst Asians, that like the whole, I'm at Rice, I have no idea how I got in here. Everybody here is so smart. You know, why me? Or you know, for the consultant that ends up in McKinsey, oh my gosh, I can't believe I made McKinsey. Everybody here is so smart. I can't believe I got in. And for everybody that Asian Americans in particular, there is a danger in terms of overcompensating. And even though I did talk about how much I appreciate humility, there's a humility in the right way. There's a humility that doesn't devalue who you are as a person and what you bring to the table, and be able to master that tension, and to have that both of those attributes, I think is really important. So know who you are, know your value, and you know, be confident in terms of who you are, and continue to be you, because there are so many gifted and talented Asian Americans that are out there that are going to do amazing things, you know, as they continue to rise up to become the next leaders in all different domains, all different aspects of our society, and I can't wait to see it.
That's very cool. Last question we have for the interview is, if you could go back in time to tell your younger self something, what would it be?
I would say go for it. I would say that you know, God has gifted you in certain ways, and God has gifted you with specific gifts and talents that are valuable. Run with those things, and don't be afraid, and know that things will work out ultimately. And I think I would have saved myself from like a lot of anxiety. I think that would have saved me from a lot of stress and anxiety that I just didn't need to have. You know, somebody once said that stress and anxiety is essentially putting a down payment for bad things that won't necessarily happen in the future. So why do it? And I think that's kind of wise. So don't worry as much. Don't worry so much. You know, have faith that good things are going to happen. Have faith that you're doing what you've been made to do. It kind of goes back to my similar answer of knowing your worth and knowing your value, and not going in with the spirit of fear.
Being fearless, you know.
Yeah.
Just going in and doing it. Yeah. I really like that. That's really nice.
Yep.
All right. So I guess we've concluded for our interview. Thank you for your time.
It's been a pleasure, Aiden.
It's very nice. And I actually learned a lot from you. And I hope to kind of take what you said, think about it, reflect, maybe utilize it. Not maybe, but we'll utilize it. So I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aiden. It's a pleasure.
Pleasure as well. Thank you.